Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Christopher Bruce. We're here to talk about place-based crime theories and models, part of my series of tutorials for crime analysis students. It's okay if you haven't seen any of the other ones. This is a standalone session. To set the stage, I want to talk about something that happened to me in New Orleans, Louisiana in 2017. This is the French Quarter of New Orleans here. If you've been to New Orleans, this is probably where you went because it has most of the food and jazz and touristy things to do in the city. And I'm a big jazz fan, so I like to go there very often. And on this particular night, I was at a club here on Frenchmen Street, which is just outside the French Quarter, but it's got a lot of good modern clubs playing in the traditional New Orleans style. In fact, on this particular trip, I was seeing this band, Tuba Skinny, playing at the club, and I highly recommend them if you'd like to check out what traditional New Orleans jazz sounds like. Tuba Skinny, but sorry, that was a digression. Anyway, I was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I left the club, and I had to head back to my hotel, which was here in the middle of the French Quarter. And if I had been smart, I would have walked down Frenchmen Street here to Decatur Street and walked back that way. You can see the sort of the highlighting in the background indicates, I guess, it indicates the commercial level of the area. And as you can see, there's like a constant strip here where there's a lot of business. There's a lot of traffic in these areas, even very late at night in New Orleans. But what I decided to do was walk down Chartres Street, just a block away, but it made a big difference. You can see there's no background for this section of Chartres Street. It's a residential area for the most part, and doesn't have a lot of traffic late at night. And I thought it was just a more direct route. Plus, it's a very pretty street, and I like the architecture and stuff on it. So I walked down there, and what happened was I got robbed. Just a block or so into my walk, two men sitting on a stoop stood up as I started to go by them, and I thought that it was just two guys hanging out on their own stoop, but one of them produced a firearm, a handgun, and pointed it at me, and the other one said, "Give me what you got." And so I gave him my money, which was about $100, a credit card that I had on me, which they took to Walmart immediately and spent on $1,000 worth of gift cards, and my iPhone, which they forced me to unlock. But fortunately, I think they must have accidentally locked it again or whatever. They didn't do anything with it. They didn't get into any of my stuff and compromise my data, which was nice. But it was still an unpleasant experience, and it's had some reverberations since then. So I asked an AI image generator to recreate the moment, and this is what he came up with. This is not quite the reality of the situation, although I am bald and was wearing a sports jacket like that. It's not the area of New Orleans that has Mardi Gras beads strewn on the street, and there's no streetcar in that area. And only one of the guys had guns, and they didn't, it wasn't like this. But anyway, that's what the AI came up with. But this is the actual place where it happened, which I later picked up here on Google Street View. This car here is blocking the stoop where they were sitting, but basically you get a sense of what the area looks like. Of course, keep in mind it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and also, very dark. So the environment looked a little bit different than this. As you can see, there isn't much in the way of lighting in this area. No visible security cameras. And these are the types of things that we need to talk about when it comes to place-based criminology theories. Now, let's distinguish place-based criminology theories. And a lot of people use the term environmental criminology to talk about this grouping of theories. Environmental criminology or place-based theories, I want to distinguish this from other criminology theories, because classic criminology, most criminology that was developed through the first part of the 20th century would have focused primarily on the guys. Now, only one guy is visible here, but that's okay. We'll focus on him. It would have focused on that person. What were his motivations? Why did he choose to commit this crime? Why is he a bad guy? And different theorists came up with a lot of different explanations throughout the 20th century for that his behavior, why he chose to commit the robbery. And it could go back to unique psychological or genetic characteristics such as predisposition towards aggression or thrill-seeking, or low intelligence or something like that. He could have learned how to commit the crime from other people. That's what differential association theory would have said. He could be suffering economic strain and frustration caused by a lack of opportunities. That would be strain theory, etc. You can see some of the other theories there, all the way down to demonology theory, which is sort of the oldest criminology theory. Not really a criminology theory because it's not testable. It's not falsifiable, but that he's just evil. But the point is that we would have focused on him, and then most of the solutions that we might have had would have been around trying to get rid of this person's root motivations. Now, what does it take to get rid of motivations like that you're prone to aggression or you have low intelligence? All that starts, in the womb, really. It starts with the mother's diet and whether she smokes or drinks during pregnancy and whether he's exposed to lead paint and so forth. And, trying to counter the effect of how you learn from other criminals maybe in the area growing up, as differential association says, involves, improving the social safety net of areas and ending gangs and all kinds of things that take a long time, right? None of that stuff, none of these criminology theories were going to help me on that particular night avoid this crime. They would have taken, probably he's already lost under most of these theories, right? They would have taken decades to develop and to reduce crime in a new generation of potential criminals. Similarly, most traditional policing models would focus on this individual. All right, if we want to prevent this crime from happening again, how do we do it? We arrest the guy who did the first one. And so you'd have, traditional investigations based on DNA, fingerprinting. Not really in a robbery would you do DNA analysis, but you do some traditional investigation, canvassing, asking people if they saw anything. Look, maybe having me look at mugshot photographs of past robberies, which would have been an utter waste of time because I have almost face blindness. I wouldn't have been able. I could barely tell the race that the two people were. But there are modern models like profiling and focus deterrence and intelligence-led policing that would focus on the individual and trying to prioritize certain individuals for prosecution and warrant service and removal from the streets in order to address those top offenders. So that's traditional criminology and traditional law enforcement. What we're going to do is contrast these things with models that focus not on that individual so much, but the place, the thing that we're seeing on the right-hand side. What is it about this location that might give rise to this particular type of crime? One of the things we might ask ourselves right away is this an unusual crime, right, in this particular location? And I took a look. Of course, I couldn't go back to 2017, but on the New Orleans Police Department website, you can look at robberies for the last couple of years. I looked at 2025. This is only individual robberies, what we used to call street robberies back when I was a crime analyst. And mine happened right about here. So yeah, there are some other ones in the immediate area. Not as many as there are down in this part of the French Quarter, where there are a lot more people, so a lot more potential targets down here. But I do find it interesting that, like, right here in the heart of the quarter, where a lot of the jazz clubs are and so forth, and a lot of the restaurants, there isn't much going on, but there are a lot of robberies around the fringes of the quarter, maybe catching people like me who are walking back and forth. In any event, these areas do have a lot more. This area does have a lot more robberies than other parts of the city, and so what place-based theories would focus on are questions like, why do a small number of places generate such a disproportionate amount of crime? Does police presence at such places suppress crime? What are the spatial and environmental factors that facilitate or suppress crime? How do offenders make decisions about where they commit their crimes, and how do we change the physical environment in order to reduce crime? These are some of the things that would have been asked under place-based theories. And then the answers to these questions might help us create models of policing, or models of crime prevention, I should say, that make it less likely that robberies like mine would happen at that particular location. So the theories and models that we're going to be talking about over the course of this video are listed here. And I've kind of tried to list the model that best goes with a related theory next to it. But I do want to emphasize right here off the bat that there isn't a direct one-to-one connection between the theory and the model. Sometimes theories were developed in isolation from the models. Sometimes they were developed after the models, and the model just happens to support the theory best. Sometimes they were developed by the very similar people or people working together, like rational choice theory and situational crime prevention. But other times they were developed by different people, and there's an extent to which, for instance, George Kelling and James Q. Wilson might object to zero-tolerance policing being the outcome of broken windows theory. I also would like to emphasize, as I do every time I'm talking about criminology theory, that these models and these theories are not in competition with each other. It's not like, I'm asking you to study them all and to choose one, to pick one that you think is best or best explains the situation. Now, I personally happen to believe that rational choice theory can encompass almost every other theory and model that exists. The tenets of rational choice theory are broad enough that you could bring everything else into it. But that's my own particular take. But I'm going to be covering it last, partly for that reason and partly because it's the last chronologically. I also want to emphasize that when we're talking about theories here, we're talking about the outgrowth of formal criminological research, which frankly did not exist until roughly the beginning of the 20th century. If you study criminology, you study some earlier criminologists. The two Cesares are often talked about, Cesare Lombroso and Cesare Beccaria, which were before the turn of the 20th century. But mostly we dismiss what they came up with, or at least footnote it quite heavily. We didn't really know how to do scientific research in the way that we know how to do it now. We didn't have a body of social science that existed until about the beginning of the 20th century. So, crime maps go back a lot longer than this. They go back probably to ancient times. The idea that certain crimes coalesce into hotspots, and therefore the people that are responsible for law enforcement ought to spend more time in those hotspots, probably goes back to ancient times. We don't have a lot of writings about it, but it's just so obvious that it's hard to imagine that the sentinels of Rome, or the guards in Egypt, or whoever was responsible for keeping order and stopping crime didn't know that, well, there's more crime in these places, therefore we ought to be in those places. So it's not like we suddenly got that idea in 1989 when Lawrence Sherman wrote about hotspot policing. What these theories and models in the dates that I give and the creators that I give are the people who really formalized our conception of these ideas, started to test them with actual empirical research, and sometimes gave them the name. We might have been aware of the concept before, but these folks actually gave them a name, and then put the different tenets in place that we still believe in today. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time. I don't want to take. I could literally teach a semester-long course on just this one slide, but we're going to do a sort of just a whirlwind tour of these different theories to define them for you. And what I highly recommend that you do is go to something like ChatGPT, assuming when you watch this that's still available for free, and play with these ideas. Right? You can ask it questions like how does social disorganization theory relate to community policing, or how is there any Are there any reflections of broken windows theory in situational crime prevention or something like that? Try to mix and match and see what it comes up with. You can ask the AI to define these different theories and models for you, to give you the key bullet points of what they're about. Maybe feed in a specific scenario. We have a hotspot of auto thefts in a Walmart parking lot. What would routine activities theory have to say about why that's happening, and what would zero tolerance policing say about what we should do about it, right? You can ask those questions, and that'll really help you understand what's going on with these theories. Obviously, don't copy and paste anything that you get as the result into any kind of paper, but it is going to help you explore the theories if you use AI for things like that. Now let's jump in by talking about some of the earliest theories, social disorganization theory, which focused on the neighborhood level. A lot of these other theories focus on the micro level, like a city block or a park or a street corner or something like that. But social disorganization theory was aggregated to the neighborhood level. It came out of the Chicago School of Criminology, first published in the 40s based on research done in the 1920s. And to sort of set the stage, I have a map here of a choropleth map of crime in New York City, violent crime. This is for the first half of 2024. Total violent crimes reported in New York City. NYPD data is freely available on the internet that you can download and play with, which is a nice thing about modern society. And I wanted to have a map that I made, right here at the beginning, because the first class that is going to see this video is one about spatial analysis and crime mapping, and I wanted to say right at the beginning, in order to develop these theories, you have to be able to map crime, right? So that's why this type of spatial analysis is important. That's why these GIS techniques that we're going to be doing are important. Naturally, they didn't have these tools back in the 1920s. They had to use drawn maps in which they painstakingly counted individual incidents. We can do it a lot faster these days. Anyway, you can see here that this is New York City. New York City, I don't know if you know this, but it's quite a safe city as far as cities go. Despite it being the largest city in the United States, it has a crime rate much well below the average for American cities. I think it's right about the 25% mark. There are safer cities like San Diego, but New York City is very safe as cities go. But there are some areas of New York City that have a higher crime rate than others. Now, I don't know how well you know New York City, but you've got Manhattan here sticking into the harbor, and then you've got Brooklyn and Queens on the western tip of Long Island to the right. You've got Staten Island here, and the Bronx across the river from Manhattan up here. And as you can see, some of these neighborhoods have a lot more crime than others. The lowest neighborhood had 58 violent crimes in the first half of 2024. The highest had 2,100. And these aren't, I shouldn't say neighborhoods, these are actually police precincts, but the precincts are kind of aligned to historical neighborhoods in the city. So the question becomes, what is it about some of these neighborhoods that cause them to have more crime than others? Now, this would be more persuasive perhaps if I had done it as a rate rather than just a count of the overall crimes, because you tend to have more crimes in more populated areas. New York City, though, is pretty densely populated throughout, so I don't know if that would have showed a lot different. And it's always a little bit misleading when you do it by residential population, because like areas of lower Midtown Manhattan here, this is the one that you're seeing me hover my mouse around is around Madison Square Park, I think. This is just a very densely, it's not that it's so much densely populated, it's a very dense commercial center. There's just a lot of people there every single day. And so more activity creates more opportunity, creates more crime. But that's routine activities theory. We're focused on social disorganization now. And so we're focused on these neighborhoods like the Bronx up here, and East Elmhurst in Queens, and the Jamaica neighborhood of Queens, and East New York, which is this neighborhood of Brooklyn, that have not only high crime rates, but a lot of high poverty rates, physical dilapidation, other social indicators like unemployment, single-parent households, a lot of recent immigration. And so Sean McKay were sort of some of the first to identify at a neighborhood level these correlations. They did their work in Chicago, not New York City, and they found some interesting patterns that don't exist much anymore, such as sort of a more, in Chicago, there was a lot more crime towards the center of the city and less as you got outside the city. That all started to change, though, in the 1990s when it became fashionable for people with money to move back into cities again. So those types of patterns are shot. But this idea that there's this strong correlation, again, at the neighborhood level, not the individual level. There'd already been lots of people, who believed that crime and poverty were linked because a person who was poor might have more motivation to commit crime. But at the neighborhood level, poverty within a neighborhood, physical dilapidation within the neighborhood, lack of social institutions, lots of transition. This was first identified by Sean McKay. So, and I'm sorry this is covering Staten Island, but, it's Staten Island. So crime rates tend to be stable across neighborhoods over time. And neighborhoods with high crime tend to have a lot of concentrated poverty, residential instability, ethnic heterogeneity. That means people who are not, homogeneity means, a lot of people who are the same ethnicity. Ethnic heterogeneity means there's a lot of different ethnicities. And family disruption. Parents working, children, latchkey children having to come home without parents at the house, single parent families, things like that. What they found in a lot of these neighborhoods is because people are so focused on just getting by, and many of them are planning to leave the neighborhood as soon as they can. There's always new people coming in, that there's a lot of there's a weakness of informal social control, right? Where people don't know their neighbors. They don't know, the person standing in front of their building right now shouldn't be there. They don't have any ownership stake in their building. And I don't just mean economically. I mean they just don't feel like it's fundamentally their property or their territory. They're only there for a short time. They don't have political power. They don't have a friend in the mayor's office who they can call when a drug house opens on the corner. And so they lack what Sean McKay termed collective efficacy to do something about their lot in life. And crime flourishes in those areas because of that lack of ownership, because people just don't know each other and aren't looking out for each other. And so the solution is to strengthen those social institutions and help develop that collective efficacy. Now, I feel that the model that most closely associates with that is community policing, is this effort that we started in the 1970s, long after Sean McKay wrote, to strengthen ties not only between the police department and the community, but between members of the community, so that we could develop institutions like neighborhood watches and community groups and community improvement associations that would take an ownership in their neighborhoods and try to make things better. And that's really what community policing is about giving some democratic voice to the community and how they're policed, and some democratic governance of policing back to the community. Information sharing back and forth, so that when you see that suspicious person in front of your building, you know exactly who to call in the police department, and you know that they'll come and actually do something about it. That makes a huge difference. I wish I could spend more time on both of these concepts, but we've got to move on. So let's move on. But as we do, we're going to see echoes of this in some of these other theories. The next is SEPTED and defensible space theory, which were developed with sort of awareness of each other and around the same time. So they're often thought of as essentially the same thing. And some people think of SEPTED as a theory more so than a model, but I see it, since it offers specific things to do, I see it more as a model. But they're both very similar in what they argue, that crime is about the physical space, and there are certain physical spaces that are more amenable to crime than others. And some of these things, some of the things that they argue here are very, very obvious. Like putting a fence around a house is, going to make it harder to go burglarize the house than if you don't have a fence around the house. Forcing people to sign in at a security desk when they come into an office building means that their thieves are less likely to go prowling around the building looking for stuff to steal than if you don't require them to do that. In my town I used to work for, we used to have a huge problem with thefts from lockers at health clubs before they started forcing people to go through a sign-in process, checking ID at the front desk. So there's some obvious stuff in both in these things. But what I like about Defensible Space and CPTED both is how changes to the physical environment can create a psychological effect that makes it less likely crime is going to happen. If you take a look at the image in the lower right there, that fence really isn't much of a fence, and we can't really tell. It's a stylized drawing, but it doesn't suggest that it's much of a fence, like maybe you could step over it or something like that. It isn't so much about creating a physical barrier as a sense of separation of public space and private space. And you'll notice this as you walk down streets in densely populated cities where the houses are right up there on the street corner. They still very often might, through a change in the pavement or just a little row of plants planted or something, show where the barrier is between the public space and the private space. And believe it or not, that does have a significant effect on the likelihood that somebody's going to enter that private space and commit a crime. A lot of what's done in CPTED is about simple maintenance, maintaining an area so that it looks nice to send a signal that somebody is in charge. Right? Just look at the before and after in the upper left here on this sort of walking path. Right? How much of a difference it makes to have it maintained. How inviting it looks on the right-hand side versus the left-hand side. It looks scary on the left-hand side, right? You might not walk down there. You don't know who's going to be in the grass, literally lying in the tall grass. But on the right-hand side, you've got open visibility, so you can see, if anybody was around, if anybody was coming, and that's a large part of what natural surveillance is about. So it's about reducing the likelihood of crime by maintaining the physical space, by controlling access, by enforcing the idea of territoriality. Defensible space theory talked about safe adjoining areas, right? And defensible space theory was more about individual buildings than neighborhoods. But it's important if you have a building that you want to reduce crime in. Then you want to make sure the park next to the building is also safe, right? Because otherwise, that's going to spill over into the building. I should mention, by the way, that defensible space theory was developed by the researcher noted through statistics that high-rise apartment buildings, big apartment buildings, actually had more crime on a per capita level, not just a total level, than smaller places. And you would think, the opposite, because it's hard to get into a high-rise building, right? But the reason is that when you have that many people living collectively in a building, they start to feel a lack of individual ownership over the place. If you've got a condo building with like 4 owners, they're all going to feel very strong, and they know each other, of course. They're going to feel a collective ownership, and they're not going to let people sleep in the stairwell and so forth. But when you get a high-rise building of 300 people, each individual's ownership stake is diluted, and they don't know who's supposed to be there and who isn't. Notice how this is getting back a little bit to social disorganization theory. There is an element of social disorganization here in this idea of defensible space. It's just being brought to the micro level instead of the macro level. Okay, moving on. While we're talking about social disorganization theory, it kind of had a modern offshoot in the 1980s. In the guise of broken windows theory, which argued very similar things that social disorganization theory had argued. And the CPTED argued that crime flourishes in areas with visible signs of decay, neglect, and lack of ownership. They can be both physical and behavioral. And I think it's the behavioral element that really got added to broken windows theory despite the name. George Kelling, who I had the pleasure of knowing when he was alive, a fantastic criminologist. We'll have to talk about him in a minute. We talk about the Kansas City Preventive Patrol Experiment. And James Q. Wilson wrote, I think it was in 1982, they published an article about broken windows in the Atlantic. And they talked about this issue of how these minor civilities, this minor disorder, sends a signal to people that this neighborhood is open for offenders. You can come in here, you can set up shop, you can deal drugs, you can run an auto body shop that buys stolen car parts. You can stand in alleyways and harass women when they walk by, and nobody's going to care. How do we know that nobody's going to care? Take a look at the neighborhood. Obviously, nobody cares. There's junk cars on the street. There's graffiti. There's panhandlers operating, harassing people as they walk by. There's no cops anywhere. This is clearly not a place that you're going to get into any trouble if you choose to apply your particular crime trade. And so their solution was we should deal with those minor incidents of incivility and physical decay, and people will get the sense that there's an ownership stake in the neighborhood, that somebody actually does care, and will send the signal that crime is not, in fact, welcome here. And that morphed for a while into zero-tolerance policing in the 1990s, particularly in New York City, where to implement this, the police, aggressively enforced things like turnstile jumping and aggressive panhandling. They had these people that would come slop dirty water on windshields at traffic lights and then ask for money to squeegee it off. Public intoxication, parking violations, vagrancy, things like that. Now, at this point, we should talk a little bit about some of the ethical and civil liberties concerns about some of these solutions. This should be something that we keep in our heads throughout this discussion. If we go back a little bit to CPTED here, right? Controlling access, fencing things off, making it more difficult to get in, making it less anonymous to get in and out of places. This is all well and good, but if you try to apply this to, say, a neighborhood or a street or a public park, you run the risk of really infringing on people's civil liberties. For a while, I remember I went to New York City Police in the 1990s and attended a seminar that they give, and they talk about something called the Model Block Program, where they would basically go and declare martial law on a particular city block for like a week or two, and they would force people coming in and out of that block to show ID that proved they lived there, that proved they had a legitimate reason to be there, and it certainly reduced crime. You get that heavy a presence in an area, there isn't much that's going to happen, but it's still an infringement on civil liberties, and if it's not handled with the cooperation of the people that live there, you could easily see how something like that could go wrong. Anytime you have any type of intensive enforcement, things can go wrong. So, you get here to zero-tolerance policing, and yes, there is a criminological basis through which enforcement of these minor things can help prevent more serious crimes, but at the same time, you're spending a lot of police attention on rousting people for, panhandling and graffiti and things like that. And of course, that's going to come down hardest on the most disadvantaged classes within the city. And if it's not handled constitutionally and with the right amount of training, it's going to come down hardest on the people that the police choose to enforce this activity on, which might be more likely to be minorities. So you've got to be very careful about how you implement this sort of thing, which is why zero-tolerance policing has mostly fallen out of favor and isn't talked about much more as a viable policing strategies. But there's still, I think, a place for it. It's just maybe zero tolerance doesn't have to mean being very aggressive, right? Or it doesn't have to mean throwing the book at people or putting them in handcuffs and arresting them for every one of these violations. Maybe we could do it in a more collegial, community-oriented way. Okay, the next one we're going to talk about is routine activities theory, and this was developed by Marcus Felsen and Larry Cohen in the late 1970s to help explain why crime had increased so much in the 1970s. These graphs show per capita changes in violent crime, property crime, and especially murder throughout this period. And as we can see from the 1960 all the way through the 60s and into the 70s, crime continued to rise. It peaked. Violent crime in general peaked in the early 1990s before it started to fall. Murder peaked a little bit earlier than that. So did property crime. But at the time that Felsen and Cohen were writing, it was still on the upswing. And there were two competing explanations, really, for why crime was increasing so much during this period. One was a sort of a very left-wing, I suppose, explanation, almost Marxist explanation, that it was all about poverty, it was all about lack of opportunity, it was all about racial oppression. And it's not that those things aren't true or that those things don't lead to crime. It's just, it's not clear why they would have been getting worse during this period. In fact, we were going through an economic boom through much of the 1960s while this crime was increasing. So the other explanation that was very common during this period was a very conservative explanation, a very right-wing explanation, that it was all about the weakening of morals in society. We've got all kinds of craziness going on now. We've got much more divorces and people having sex all the time and before they're married, and women entering the workforce and women's liberation and civil rights marches and Vietnam protests and this is just all this is happening, and it's weakening the moral fabric of society. And if people don't have morals, they don't fear God. Oh yeah, that's another one, right? Where no more God in our schools. All this atheism going around. People aren't going to adhere to the straight and narrow, and they're going to commit crime. Well, what Felsen and Cohen tried to do was change the question, not from why is crime increasing, but what could be creating more opportunities for crime to happen during this period. And so they developed a very simple model about why crime happens. Crime happens when a motivated offender encounters a suitable target at a time and place where there's this absence of capable guardianship. That's it. Motivated offender, suitable target, lack of guardianship at a particular time and place, the crime is going to occur. Wow, can you see how that applies to, my street corner here, right? It's the middle of the night. Here I am walking along. If I have to be, honest, maybe a little bit tipsy, middle-aged guy, wearing a suit coat, so I look like I'm a little bit well off. Perfect suitable target, walking by two motivated offenders on a dark street corner when there's nobody else around. Perfect conflation of these three elements. If any of those elements hadn't been there, then the crime wouldn't have happened. If those guys hadn't been sitting there, if I chose to walk a different way, or if a police officer, say, had happened to roll by at the exact time that I was there, that he would have supplied the capable guardianship, and the crime wouldn't have happened. So their point was that throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the routine activities of society changed in ways that created more opportunities for these three things to come together. And to some extent, the conservatives were right. More women entering the workforce, not a bad thing by itself, but created more opportunities for victimization, both of the house, which was now unattended at home, and their cars, which are now being parked in commuter parking lots and so forth, and the women themselves, who are now walking to and from work and maybe having a drink afterwards, and are out and about in society and vulnerable in a way that they weren't before. Also, that was happening in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot more theater culture, nightlife, people going to bars, discos, and so forth, and in not staying home, watching TV the way they might have in the 1950s. And that created a lot more opportunities for crime to happen. We kind of saw, if you look at that chart again, during COVID, we had a weird increase in murder during that period, but property crime continued to go down quite a bit. It had sort of a low point here, and it bumped up a little bit afterwards. And that's a sign of routine activities, right? When everybody's home, everybody's quarantining, nobody's going to bars, restaurants, movie theaters, and so forth, there are fewer opportunities for crime to occur. So this theory, which I'm a huge fan of. It explains a lot in why crime varies from place to place. There are simply more opportunities in some cities for crime to come together. If you took this same map that I showed you of New Orleans, and you, not that one. There we go. And you looked at a similar place like downtown Omaha or something, I guarantee you would see fewer robberies in the middle of the night, because the middle of the night, that place shuts down and there just isn't any potential for victimization. Look how there's no robberies here in Louis Armstrong Park. Louis Armstrong Park, is a beautiful place named after one of my favorite people in history. But you're not going to walk through Louis Armstrong Park in the middle of the night. And so there, even if you did, maybe you'd be more likely to be robbed, but nobody's going to do it because it's such a dark and uninviting place in the middle of the night. And so there's no opportunity for the robbery to happen in the first place. So routine activities can help explain why crime varies from one city to another, one time period to another, one neighborhood to another, based on the likelihood that a victim and an offender are going to encounter each other at a place where there's no guardianship. And I shouldn't it's not just about people, by the way. This helps explain why crime happens in certain parking lots to cars, or why certain neighborhoods are more targeted for residential burglary. For a while, when I was the crime analyst in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we had sort of a perfect storm of factors here, where there was a homeless shelter here on Albany Street, and up here on Massachusetts Avenue, this commercial center, there were a couple of stores that would buy used CDs and even cassette tapes, I think, back then. And then there was a liquor store here in Central Square too that sold like nip bottles of alcohol. And then in between all of this, the homeless shelter and the store and then the liquor store were all these sort of tech companies that had people working during the day and parking their cars in parking lots in the neighborhood. What do you suppose happened every morning? A subset of the population, I don't want to demonize all homeless people, but a subset of the population left the homeless shelter, went directly to one of those parking lots, broke a window, scooped up a bunch of CDs and cassette tapes, and then took them and sold them, and then went to the liquor store. So that's a perfect example of where a sitting target of cars was still intersected by a motivated offending population that could make use of what they had to offer. So there are a lot of potential solutions to crime based on routine activities theory, involving removing the motivated offender through apprehension techniques, removing the suitable target or hardening the target, and supplying the capable guardianship. So you could apply SEPTED techniques to routine activities theory. You could apply rational choice techniques. So I've just chosen one, but I think hotspot policing applies very well to routine activities theory by supplying the capable guardianship. And hotspot policing is all about using crime mapping to identify where hotspots are throughout a particular area of a particular crime or crime in general, and then putting police officers in those locations at the right times in order to suppress that activity. Now, as I said, we probably knew how to do this going back to ancient times, but it took us a while to get here in formal terms, because in 1973, the Kansas City Preventive Patrol Experiment had shown that patrol officers driving around neighborhoods didn't seem to have a preventative effect on crime. And so the doctrine that criminologists largely believed for the next couple of decades was police don't prevent crime. Police officers out there on the street in uniform in cars don't do anything to prevent crime, because when they removed those people from certain neighborhoods in Kansas City in 1973, crime did not increase. And when they doubled the amount of patrol in other neighborhoods, crime didn't decrease. Not only that, people didn't even seem to notice. People didn't feel less afraid or more afraid, or report that they saw fewer or more police officers. But That has a lot to do, I think it turns out, with just the ratio of the number of officers that was in those neighborhoods and the physical space they have to cover. Nobody commits a crime right in front of a police officer, or very rarely do they do that, right? So obviously the police have some preventive effect, and it's just about finding the right totality of physical space that an individual officer can expect to have a reductive effect on. But when you're looking at something like, an individual city and identifying hotspots this way, well, these top hotspots are actually quite small. They might come down to individual parking lots. And so by instructing police officers to spend more time in those individual lots or individual street corners or what have you, we can in fact suppress the crime that happens there. And this is a big part of what a lot of crime analysts do, is try to refine their predictions about where crime is going to happen by things like time of day of week, other events like a particular, like a sports team's playing or a concert is coming to town, weather factors, and so forth. And we're starting, we have plenty of research now that shows that hotspot policing works. What I think is starting to develop is a body of research that shows what police do matters, right? Physical presence alone does seem to have a reductive effect no matter what the officer does, but if we can target some of what they do, give them a strategy to follow while they're in those hotspots by telling them more about what crimes are happening and what the MOs are and what types of individuals are involved and so forth, they know who to talk to, who to watch, who to stop, and so forth. Now again, I have to take us to some ethical considerations, because nothing about hotspot policing, nothing about putting more police in areas that have a high crime rate means be a dick about it, frankly, right? But that's what happens, unfortunately, in some agencies in some of these areas. And I want to highlight in particular the killing of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee in 2023. He was killed by officers from this unit, the Scorpion unit, which was meant to be doing hotspot policing, basically. But nothing should have said that they had to be overly aggressive about it, that they had to produce a certain number of arrests. It seems like the officer who, if you read the reports about what happened, who first stopped him for literally no reason, was simply self-conscious about the fact that he'd made fewer arrests than other people in his team. But there's nothing about hotspot policing that says you have to be this way. A hotspot policing officer could be a friendly officer, somebody who waves to people, who talks to them, who hears about their concerns, and if they have to make an arrest, still does so in a constitutional, respectful way. It doesn't have to be heavy-handed, but unfortunately, because of the number of things that have happened lately involving police and their communities, a lot of these negative interactions have caused people to question whether we really do want more police, even in high crime areas. Because you put more police in high crime areas, they're going to stop more residents, they're going to ask questions of more residents, there's more opportunities for those interactions to go bad, and maybe we'd rather they just stayed away and we lived with the fact that this is a high crime area rather than have to be afraid of our own police. It really sucks that we have gotten to that point in society, but unfortunately there we are. So we've got to think carefully about that. On the analytical side, can we trust that this agency can police in a friendly, respectful, community-oriented, constitutional manner? Or if we tell them to spend more time in hotspots, are they going to aggressively stop and frisk minorities and just be an overall menace to the neighborhood? It's a question that I wish we didn't have to ask, but unfortunately we do. All right, starting to wrap things up a little bit, let's go into crime pattern theory. Crime pattern theory was the first theory to focus, the only one really, to focus on how offenders make decisions about where they commit crimes. If you've got somebody who lives in Buffalo, New York, and he decides that it would be a good idea to break into houses and sell property in order to make some money, what houses does he choose to break into? Where does he choose to go? And so crime pattern theorists focus on the journey to crime, you know, the length of the trip and the specific nature of the trip a person makes in order to commit a crime from his or her home base. And there's a few interesting things that they found through both quantitative and qualitative means. They have found, for instance, that offenders generally seek to minimize a travel distance. So that, the guy in Buffalo doesn't want to travel to Syracuse to commit his burglary. Right? That's a lot of work. You might as well get a job at that point, right? Why don't I'm going to commit my crime, in Buffalo, or at least in one of the surrounding suburbs. In the same way that when you go to shopping, you don't go miles and miles away. You go to the closest grocery store that is convenient, that has what you're looking for. And offenders go to the closest neighborhoods that have what they're looking for. Except they don't typically commit the crimes right around their own neighborhood. They have a buffer zone around places they're intimately known, that they know intimately, where they live and they work and they entertain and so forth. And there's a couple of reasons for those buffer zones. I don't know that that's been well studied, why those buffer zones exist. To some degree, it might be about opportunity. If you're a bank robber, unless you live next door to a bank, you have to travel some distance. Some of it has to do with the likelihood that you're going to be caught and recognized, right? So you don't rob the convenience store next, on the block that you live in, that you frequently shop in, because you don't want the clerk to recognize you. And there's probably some psychological element about not polluting your own environment, not peeing in your own pool, so to speak. But outside that buffer zone, there's this high likelihood that the offender is likely to commit the crime, and then it decays. We call it distance decay from there. And the idea here is if you get like a good data set of a particular type of offender in your area, the home where the person lives and where the person committed their crimes, and calculate the distance traveled, you can identify what the specific function is for that particular offender type. And this varies a lot by offense type. As you might imagine, domestic violence offenders, for instance, it's completely opposite, right? They don't have that buffer zone. They're more likely to commit their crimes in the home, highly likely to commit the crimes in the home, and then it decays very. I couldn't draw that very smoothly, but it would decay very quickly after that. But the one shown here might be more for something like a street robbery or a residential burglary or something. So a couple other things that have been found through crime pattern theory is this division between commuters and marauders. Some offenders commit their crimes in a pattern where it's sort of in a radius around where they live, and other offenders like to travel not terribly far, but at least some distance, like they're commuting to work before they start picking their targets. When it comes to where they choose to go, what crime pattern theory has found is that they tend to find places that they're familiar with, but not intimately familiar with. So the places they drive through between home and work, or between work and the gym, or something like that. They're aware of how the neighborhood works, what its entrances and exits are, and so forth. They can picture it, and they can think of maybe potentially good targets in those areas, but it's not something that's completely strange to them, but it's also not overly familiar to them. Now, I don't know if there hasn't been a lot of good research, I don't think, in how that's changing in the era in which we all have cell phones with Google Maps, and we can call up Street View and search for things. I do it all the time to search for restaurants. I can't imagine there aren't some burglars who don't use their phones to look for potential neighborhoods where they might ply their trade, and that might change how they make those decisions. I don't think that's been very well documented. The discipline of geographic profiling grows out of crime pattern theory. It was first articulated by Dr. D. Kim Rossmo in the 1990s. And the idea with geographic profiling is that, well, look, if we can do this, if we can model the likely travel distance that an offender makes to commit their crimes, let's say we have a known pattern of crimes, or a series of crimes rather, such as, in this case, this example, convenience store robberies. So we've got a bunch of convenience store robberies. If we can apply that function to all of them and reverse the algorithm, basically, we can identify the place in which the offender most likely lives. And then maybe by looking at known offenders who live in that area, or other investigative means, help narrow down the list of people that we have to focus on. So that's what geographic profiling is all about, identifying the likely home base, whether it's a residence or some other place of a criminal offender based on where the crimes are committed. And obviously, that has to be done with modern spatial analysis tools. Okay, the last theory that I will get into, and it's my favorite, so I hate to be so late on this recording, is rational choice theory. And rational choice theory was developed, it was actually sort of reverse developed. The model that goes with it, situational crime prevention, came first. And then rational choice kind of worked out an explanation for why situational crime prevention worked. They were both developed by a British criminologist, Ronald Clark, who I had the pleasure of knowing. He died just last year. I'm recording this in early 2026. He died in 2025. And it was a very sad day for all of us in the criminal justice and crime analysis and crime prevention communities. In developing rational choice theory, he resurrected a very old theory, probably the earliest criminology theory that we nowadays call classical criminology, developed during the Enlightenment, right around the time the American Revolution was going on, by Cesare Beccaria, an Italian nobleman, who was really sort of arguing, he was making an anti-death penalty argument, but he was trying to argue that we don't have to keep increasing the severity of punishment in order to reduce crime. He said criminals are rational people. We're all rational people, and there's a criminal in all of us. We weigh the reward that we might get from committing a crime with the potential punishment. And it's not only the severity of the punishment, but it's the likelihood that the punishment is going to be imposed. Are we even going to be caught for it? And of course, he's writing from a perspective, a period in which we didn't have any investigative science. We had no fingerprinting, no DNA, no blood type analysis, nothing. If somebody didn't see you commit the crime, then you probably didn't get caught committing the crime. So we had in most places, like the death penalty was the default penalty for any serious crime, and he was saying that's just unnecessary because the likelihood of getting caught is so small that the severity of the punishment doesn't even come into play. But the part that's really remembered from his work is this simple model. Jeremy Bentham, an English utilitarian philosopher, also wrote about this, the hedonistic calculus, weighing the reward with the risk and ultimately deciding whether to commit the crime. Now, modern criminologists, or criminologists throughout the 20th century, would have regarded Beccaria's model as being too simplistic and not explaining an awful lot of things, right? Why is there white collar crime? Why is crime committed by people who have enough? Why do people still commit crimes even when the penalty that they know that they're facing is quite severe? During the 1990s, when three strikes legislation became really popular, right? And you faced life in prison on your third felony. Why did anybody ever go and commit that third felony? Isn't there any room for morality in any of this? Why do certain people tend to more likely to be criminals than others, even when faced with the same risks and rewards? So there was a lot of stuff that his theory didn't explain. But Clark and Derek Cornish kind of resurrected this in the 1980s and suggested that it was mostly a matter of just, Beccaria not having considered enough variables. And the way that I'm presenting it here, this is not, I don't know, Ron Clark would not have presented it this way, and he might disagree with some of the things that I've put on here. what I take from rational choice theory isn't any specific model or a specific formula, but simply the very idea that the decision to commit a particular crime, not be a criminal, but to commit a particular crime, can be modeled as a series of variables. And that, yes, risk and reward are certainly two of those variables. They're just not the only variables, or we also have to expand them a bit to talk about different types of reward and different types of risk. And so if I had to hypothesize what the formula would look like, this is as close as I can come right now, that on this, and the idea, by the way, is that this model is always in play for everybody, constantly, but mostly subconsciously. And for most of us, the left-hand side, do not commit the crime, is so far weighed down that it never enters our conscious thought process that a crime is even an available option. So under rational choice theory, when I walked by these guys on this this street, some subconscious part of my mind was aware that I could rob them. And it never occurred to me, I never thought about it, I never considered it, because there would have been virtually no reward for me to do so, and the risk would have been enormous. First of all, it would have been one guy on two guys, and I did not have a gun, and I didn't know that they did until they showed it, but still, right? The odds were against me from the outset. I didn't need the money. They likely would have had. They probably didn't have very much. The average person doesn't carry very much money. And if I got caught, it would have absolutely ruined my professional reputation and life. And not only that, I just don't believe in doing that sort of thing. So it never entered my mind. And so when you walk down the street and you're passing people here and there, and you see cars parked, you're not thinking, oh, I could break into that car, I could rob that person, I could punch that person, I could steal that purse. These things are not occurring to you, but suddenly now you come upon a wallet that somebody's dropped on the ground that has no ID in it and a bunch of cash, and this model comes to the forefront of your mind fast, and you suddenly become aware that crime is a choice, is something that you could choose in this particular situation. And you probably don't do it anyway, because you're a good person. You got the conscience morality side, and you think, no, I'm going to do the right thing and turn it in. Most people, I like to think, would, but you're at least aware that it's a choice, and you're aware that there are many other people out there who might not commit, who might not do the same thing as you are, even if you do the right thing. That's what rational choice theory is about. So, every crime can be considered as a product of a model of variables. And almost every other criminology theory can vector into these variables in one way or another. I don't have it all here on this particular slide, but every other criminology theory weighs into these variables in different ways. So you've got the perceived reward, right? To start with. These are the things weighing you to commit the crime. And that reward could be a financial reward, a psychological reward, or a social reward, right? A social reward meaning you get approval of your peers for doing this. Think about how gang members, congratulate each other and support each other for maybe stealing a car or something like that, right? So you've got those things weighing on the commit the crime side. And it is important to realize that financial rewards are relative, right? If you are desperate and you absolutely need money for like drugs or food or something like that, $30 might, you might be willing to risk an awful lot for $30. Whereas to even tempt me to even think about the model existing, it would have to be probably tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, before I would consider risking my freedom and my professional reputation and so forth on committing the crime. So it's all relative to the individual, and you can see how a lot of things like differential association theory and biosocial theories and so forth might vector into that perception of the reward. Now I'm going to skip neutralizations for a second, but on the left-hand side you have the risk, different things weighing against committing the crime. One is the risk of getting caught. And there are two aspects to that: the formal risk and the informal risk. And I even maybe would like to subdivide that a little bit further. I think there's a formal risk, meaning involves the criminal justice system, and then there's an informal risk that still involves the criminal justice system, and then there's the everything else. So what do I mean by that? The formal risk is, what is the criminal justice system going to do to me, right? If I commit this crime and I get caught, what type of punishment am I likely to face, and what's the likelihood that I'm actually going to get caught and get that punishment, and how fast will that happen after the crime occurs? And those three variables, the certainty and swiftness and severity, they go back to Beccaria. They are the subject of deterrence theory. And deterrence researchers look heavily on those particular variables. But I think that by focusing too much on the variables, we're kind of missing the point. There is an informal sense in which the criminal justice system punishes you too. Even if it never makes it to court, even if I don't, have to go to prison for committing a crime, if I'm identified by the police, I'm arrested, my name's in the paper, I have to hire a lawyer, I'm facing potential prosecution, that causes a lot of stress. Even the night I have to spend in jail, or the hours that I have to spend in jail while I'm waiting for my bail to be paid, that's not nothing, right? For a lot of people, that's very, very traumatic if they've never been arrested before. And so that's all part of what the criminal justice system might do. Now, then you have the rest of the informal risk, which is, for me, for any crime I commit, the informal risk would far outweigh the formal risk. If I were to go down to some electronics store and shoplift my next laptop computer in order to save myself a couple $1,000s, if I got caught, I would face nothing. I probably wouldn't even be arrested. I might get a summons for it. I have no criminal record. I'd go to court. They'd give me some sort of diversion or probation. I wouldn't face any serious punishment for something like that. But my God, I'd probably be fired. I might not lose my wife, but it would certainly have an impact on my marriage. She'd be very confused, among other things. My relationships with my friends, my neighbors, my colleagues, all are going to be impacted by that. And for many people, that is, like for me, that is much more serious than the formal risk of getting caught. Then you have to think about the risk of harm. And a lot of crimes are inherently risky. The robbery that I went through, I could have been harmed. I wasn't, but I could have been. I could have fought back. Maybe they weren't really prepared to shoot me if I didn't comply, and if I had fought back, they wouldn't have, known what to do. They faced some risk. I don't want to oversell it, but they, there was some risk. If a police officer had been coming by or happened to round the corner right when they were doing it and saw them with a gun out, he might have pulled out his own gun and fired. Anytime the police might show up, you're running the risk of some sort of physical harm. Even things like burglary have a risk of physical harm. You could cut yourself on the glass. You could, strain yourself climbing into things. You could encounter a dog on the inside. You never know, right? So there's a risk of harm associated with a lot of crimes. Then there's the effort. This is the part that, Beccaria really left out. How hard is it to commit the crime? Because crimes have to compete with legitimate ways of achieving the same rewards. And if it's easier just to get a job, then that's what somebody's going to do rather than commit a crime. That the crime that I suffered wasn't terribly difficult because all they had to do was stand up and point a weapon. But they at least had to have the weapon. They had to hang out there. Who knows how long they were waiting there? But if all they were doing was waiting for somebody to rob, that's an investment of time. They could have invested in something else. And you can imagine how other types of crimes, white-collar crime, auto theft, burglary, and so forth, are even more effort-inducing and require special skills and tools and time to do properly. And again, this is all competing against legitimate ways of investing the same effort for a similar reward. And then finally, you have the issue of conscience and morality, which some people have more developed than others. Now, on the other side of the conscience morality are these neutralizations, this idea that some offenders, as they commit their crimes, they neutralize any conscience or morality that they normally would have with excuses. Most of us do that when we speed, right? We neutralize the fact that we know that we're doing something that we shouldn't do by telling us things like, well, there's nobody else on the road. I'm not really hurting anybody. I'm just keeping up with traffic. The speed limit is set artificially low here. It's more important that I get to work on time than it is that I follow the literal speed limit. These are all techniques of neutralization that people who study this talk about: denial of responsibility, denial of victim, appeal to higher loyalties, condemnation of the condemners, and so forth. So maybe it did bother those two guys who robbed me that they were committing an armed robbery, but maybe they told themselves, well, we're robbing a guy who is here in town to exploit this city. He's this out-of-towner. He can probably afford the money that we're stealing from him. It's not hurting him. We need it more than he does. I've got to feed my family. Maybe these are things they told themselves in order to counter any natural morality that they had. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is all of it. Oh, and the anger, intoxication, mental illness are what I call confounding factors, which make it harder to assess how these variables play out in a particular offender. A good example is road rage, right? It's really hard to imagine that 6 months after the event, the guy sitting in prison for the rest of his life, having shot somebody in a road rage dispute, really thinks to himself, yes, that was worth it. It was worth the psychological reward to spend the rest of my life in prison. But in the moment when the temperature is hot, he felt he needed that type of release, and so anger really confounded what the rest of the scale would look like, and yet. Even people who are that hot from a road rage issue generally cool down quickly if a cop shows up. So there is some amount of decision-making and some amount of control that goes on, even when anger, intoxication, and mental illness are present. This might not be, the perfect model that I've shown here, but the point is, again, rational choice is all about taking the criminal decision and turning it into a set of variables that we can affect. And you can see how many of these variables are environmentally based. In particular, the risk of getting caught. All right, the risk of getting caught is going to have a lot to do with, well, let's go back to things we learned about from CPTED. Natural surveillance, the likelihood that somebody's watching, a witness, a police officer, maybe a video camera, recording the event, that I might be leaving physical evidence that's later going to be identified. All of these are things that are signals that the physical environment sends that we might be able to change. Effort can be a product of the physical environment. A fence makes it harder to get into a place and commit a crime. A lock on a door makes it less likely that the crime is going to happen. There are that's not place-based. Yeah, so, access control has a lot to do with effort. Even conscience and morality can be raised with signs saying, reminding people that shoplifting is stealing or something like that at particular locations. Perceived reward can be reduced through physical environmental signs, using a drop safe at a convenience store, so that all the money isn't in the cash register. The reward of something like graffiti is the psychological reward of seeing your tag there. So you're less likely to put it on a place where it's clear that people maintain it and are probably going to clean it off the moment that they see it, because your tag won't survive. So physical locations can do a lot to affect these rational choice variables in ways that go back again to CPTED. This is all interconnected here. The model that focuses directly on rational choice theory is situational crime prevention, which again Ron Clark wrote about before he wrote about rational choice theory. And he came up with 25 common techniques that we do to try to reduce crime, and organize them into these 5 categories, which, as you can see, directly affect the different variables of rational choice theory. Increase the effort, increase the risks, reduce the rewards, reduce provocations, remove excuses. When I was faced with a crime problem in places that I worked, I always used to love to just go through this list and see if I could think of any application of that particular technique to the particular problem that I was working on. And again, many of these are place-based. I would encourage you maybe to pause here and just think of a particular crime issue and go through this and see how these different techniques might apply to that issue. They don't all apply to all issues. but an awful lot of them do. Finally, these days, situational crime prevention is often thought of as sort of a subset or a part of the broader discipline of problem-oriented policing. Even though they were originally sort of written about separately, they've kind of been incorporated together. And I think it's important to understand the tenets of problem-oriented policing, because I am, again, a huge fan of problem-oriented policing, just like situational crime prevention and rational choice theory, and a big fan of Herman Goldstein, who I had the pleasure to meet while he was alive. Brilliant man. And he first wrote about this in 1979, but then he published this book in 1990. And over here on the right-hand side are the things that he argued in problem-oriented policing. The more important things start with focusing on underlying problems rather than individual incidents. Every single day, police officers are dispatched to things that they have fundamentally been dispatched to before, whether it's a gang shooting or a noise complaint or a barking dog or an alarm call or a auto theft from a parking lot or something like that. They have seen that before. They have seen that fundamental incident before. And when incidents are repetitive like that, we should be thinking about them collectively rather than trying to constantly solve the individual case. We should be looking at what's the underlying problem, what's the underlying opportunity here, and solving that. And that's where we take the whole thing through the SARA process: scanning, analysis, response, and assessment. Not all problems are place-based. There are many problems like thefts of copper and or other scrap metals that happen all over the place in different types of crime, even some shoplifting, some burglaries, some other types of thefts, some check forgery, some frauds, in order to give people scrap metal that they can then go and sell. So they might be very geographically dispersed, but there are some problems that are heavily focused on a particular location type or a particular location. And that's when these different place-based models like situational crime prevention or hotspot policing can really help us in reducing crime at those locations. Now, I've got an hour and 15 minutes into this, and I didn't have time for any more, but there are two final points I'd like to make before we wrap up. One is that all of these things that we've been talking about, no matter how much I've been using the term crime, can be applied to non-criminal things that are still bad. Traffic collisions, noise, disorder, stray animals, parking violation, that's kind of a crime, but not really, and parking disputes, water main breaks. I mean, there's lots of stuff that goes wrong in our cities and towns, and lots of times they are repetitive and occurrence in particular locations and are subjected to the same sorts of modus operandi that crime occurs. So none of this is really specific to crime. It's just that most people are most worried about crime, so that's what we apply it to. But we can apply this to a lot of other stuff as well. And I wish I had more time to focus on traffic collisions specifically, because there are whole models of traffic engineering and changing the physical roadway that have analogs in situational crime prevention, crime prevention through environmental design, and so forth. And the last thing I'll say is that all of these models and all of these theories depend upon an analyst. They depend upon somebody collecting the data and analyzing it, identifying hotspots, looking at the characteristic of those hotspots, and using the tools like Geographic Information Systems or GIS to create maps like this. And so if you're in that class that I'm teaching, we'll be transitioning into those techniques right now. Otherwise, I hope this was useful for whatever other class that you're taking. I'm always happy to take questions or comments by email or by telephone or by text or however you want to get in touch with me. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and have a great day.